The land stretched wide under the sun, rolling fields of green and gold that seemed to go on forever. 2,000 acres of soil, water, trees, and hills that had been passed down through one family for generations. And at the center of it all was the man who carried that legacy on his shoulders. He rose early every morning, stepping out of his old farmhouse with the smell of fresh earth filling his lungs, his boots sinking into the soil as he walked. The land was not just property to him. It was history, it was his bloodline. Every fence post, every field tilled, every tree planted carried the memory of those who came before him. His grandfather had plowed these fields with a mule and wooden tools. His father had expanded them with sweat and hard labor, and now he rode across them on his horse, the wide open sky above him, the wind brushing through tall grass like waves on an ocean. It was a life of peace and pride. Neighbors respected him, knowing he had worked hard to keep the land alive while others sold theirs to developers and watched it vanish into houses and roads. They called him stubborn sometimes, but also strong, because while the world changed around him, he refused to give up what his family had built. In town, people often greeted him with a nod of respect, whispering about the man who still held 2,000 acres when most families barely held 2. But with that respect also came envy. And envy is the seed of greed. And greed was never far away. The HOA that had sprung up nearby was like a weed, small at first but spreading quickly. A neighborhood of new houses and strict rules that choked the life out of anyone who dared to live freely. Karen, the HOA president, was its sharpest thorn, always smiling in public but always scheming behind closed doors. She liked power more than peace, and when her eyes landed on the man's land she saw not history but profit. From her porch she could see the wide green fields in the distance, and to her they looked wasted. She imagined roads cutting through them, houses stacked in neat rows, money flowing into the HOA's pockets, and her own name praised for expanding the community. So she began whispering to her board, planting ideas like poison seeds. Why should one man own so much when the community needs growth? She said, it's selfish to keep land empty when families need homes. If he won't use it properly, then we will. The board members, hungry for profit and blinded by Karen's confidence, nodded and agreed. But back on his farm the man knew nothing of the plans brewing against him. He was busy tending to his land, mending fences, repairing barns, and harvesting crops under the steady rhythm of work he had always known. His wife sometimes warned him that times were changing, that greedy eyes would not stay away forever. But he only smiled and said the land was protected by law and by his will. Still he noticed changes creeping in at the edges. Cars from the HOA driving slowly past his property lines, strangers standing with clipboards near his fences, even survey markers appearing mysteriously in his fields. He pulled them out and tossed them aside, frowning but saying nothing. Neighbors began whispering quietly, some telling him that the HOA was talking big about his land, others warning him that Karen had been bragging in meetings about future expansion. He stayed calm on the outside, but deep inside he felt the first rumble of a storm. The peace of his ancestral land was being threatened, and though he had spent his life working with patience and silence, he knew there were battles no man could avoid. At night he walked his property, lantern in hand, the stars spread wide above him, thinking of his father and grandfather, imagining their voices reminding him that the land must always stay in the family. He promised silently that he would protect it, no matter what tricks or lies the HOA tried to use. But the whispers grew louder each day. Stories of Karen talking about new development projects that matched perfectly with his land's location. Maps being passed around in HOA meetings with his fields marked in red. He had not yet faced them directly, but he knew soon the fight would come, because greedy people do not rest, and the moment Karen mistook his calm silence for weakness, she would strike bold and fast. For now he kept working, plowing the earth, sowing seeds, and riding across his acres. But in the back of his mind, suspense burned like a slow fire. He could feel the storm coming closer, and he knew when it hit, it would not just be about land. It would be about legacy, honor, and the power of a man defending what was rightfully his. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting the fields in a glow of gold and fire, he stood at the edge of his property, looking toward the distant HOA houses with their fences and lights, and he whispered softly to himself that they might think his acres were theirs. But they were about to learn just how wrong they would at. First it started small. The kind of thing most people might ignore. A letter folded neatly and slipped into his mailbox. The paper printed with bold HOA letterhead, the words sharp and threatening. It claimed his land fell under community zoning and demanded he cut down brush near his fences. remove old tractors parked by the barn, and even limit livestock to an approved number. He stared at the letter for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Because he knew none of it made sense, his land was private, well outside the HOA's reach. But the signature at the bottom in bold handwriting was Karen's. She had signed it like a judge passing a sentence. He crumpled it and tossed it into the fire, thinking that would be the end. But the next week another came, this one listing fines, saying he owed money for non-compliance, then another threatening legal action. If he continued to ignore them, neighbors started whispering more openly now, warning him that Karen was spreading rumors in town that his land wasn't really his, that it was tied to old agreements, that the HOA had rights over it. He laughed at the absurdity, but deep inside he knew lies, if repeated enough, could become dangerous. He started noticing strange cars parked along the road by his property, people with cameras taking photos of his fields and barns, some even flying drones overhead. When he shouted at them, they quickly drove off. But they always returned. The peace of his mornings was broken by the sound of tires on gravel, strangers trespassing just enough to make their presence felt. One evening he rode his horse along the boundary fence and found bright orange markers driven into the ground. Survey stakes hammered deep, as if someone had already started dividing his acres into plots. Rage flared in his chest. He yanked them out one by one and hurled them into the ditch. But he knew this was only the beginning. The next HOA meeting turned into a circus. Karen stood at the front, waving papers and maps, declaring that the unused land nearby would be perfect for expanding the community. She never said his name directly, but everyone in the room knew whose land she was pointing to on the map. Whispers filled the room, some people nodding, others shaking their heads, a few brave enough to remind her that the land was privately owned. But Karen brushed them off with her practiced smile. Ownership can be challenged if it benefits the community, she said, her words dripping with false authority. He heard all of this later from a neighbor who had attended, and though he stayed calm, his fists clenched tight as he listened. The HOA was no longer just harassing him. They were laying the foundation to steal his legacy. Over the next few weeks things escalated. New letters arrived almost daily, each one more aggressive than the last, claiming violations, unpaid dues, unapproved structures, even threats about demolishing his barns if he didn't comply. The man laughed bitterly at their arrogance. But every night as he sat on his porch watching the lights from the HOA neighborhood glow in the distance, he felt the storm building. His wife reminded him quietly that silence would only feed their greed, but he told her patience was a weapon. The more rope they gave themselves, the tighter the noose would be. Still, the harassment wore on him. The land that had once given him peace now felt like a battlefield, every letter, every drone, every whispered lie pushing him closer to the edge. And though Karen thought he was ignoring her, what she didn't know was that with every fake notice she sent, with every rumor she spread, she was only making her coming downfall greater. For now he stayed quiet, but the fire inside him burned hotter, and everyone who watched closely could sense it. That the man who had always chosen peace was being forced into war, and when he finally struck back, the HOA would not survive. It happened faster than anyone could have imagined. One morning he woke up to the low rumble of engines outside. When he stepped onto his porch he saw a line of trucks and bulldozers parked near his fence, men in hard hats walking across his fields as if they owned them, driving stakes into the soil, unrolling blueprints, and marking lines with spray paint. Confusion twisted into fury as he rode down to confront them, demanding to know what they were doing on his land. One of the men barely looked up, muttering that they were here under orders from the HOA and a development company that had purchased the property. The words hit him like a stone. Purchased. How could anyone buy what had never been for sale? He shouted at them to leave, but they only shrugged and pointed to papers clipped on their boards, contracts stamped with HOA seals and signatures that declared the land had already been sold for luxury housing. His barns, his orchards, his grazing fields, all drawn neatly into grids for roads and houses. His heart pounded as he snatched one of the papers and read, and though it looked official, he saw immediately that the signatures were fake. His own name scrawled in handwriting he had never written. Forged. Documents being waved around like truth. He tore the paper in half and threw it to the ground, shouting that this was fraud. But the workers only shrugged again, saying their job was to follow orders, not argue. Word spread fast through town. By evening everyone knew the HOA was bragging that they had finally secured the 2,000 acres. Karen walked proudly through the streets, smiling and shaking hands with investors who had arrived in expensive cars. She boasted loudly about the future. Lakeview Estates that would rise where his family's land stood. She spoke about roads, schools, parks, and profits, her voice dripping with arrogance as if the deal was already sealed. Some neighbors looked horrified, others impressed. But no one dared to challenge her openly. At the next HOA meeting she stood tall with her board beside her, showing off maps with his land covered in bold red lines. "We've done what no one else could do," she declared, her eyes flashing with triumph. "We've taken land that was rotting in the hands of one selfish man and turned it into opportunity for hundreds of families. This is the future, and no one can stop it." The room erupted in applause from her loyal supporters, but in the corner one older neighbor muttered under his breath that the land wasn't hers to sell. Karen's smile only widened. She loved the power, she loved the fear. Back on his farm, the man stood staring at the bulldozers that had already begun tearing through his fences. Cows driven off, fields trampled, workers acting as if his legacy was already gone. He clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. His silence heavy, his mind racing. He could feel the shame and anger pressing against his chest. But deep inside he also felt a spark. Karen thought she had one. She thought her forged papers and loud words made her invincible. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated the one thing stronger than her arrogance. The law, and he knew the law better than she imagined. He spent the next nights in his study, pulling out old deed books, property titles, and tax records stored in heavy chests passed down from his grandfather. Each paper a shield, each record a sword, proof that the land was his, proof that the HOA had no claim. The more he dug, the clearer the fraud became. Forged signatures, fake seals, contracts signed on dates that didn't even match county records. It was sloppy, arrogant work. The kind of crime done by people who thought no one would dare stand against them. He made copies, stacked them carefully, building his case piece by piece. His wife watched him silently, her steady presence keeping his fury from spilling over. "They think they sold your land," she said softly. "But soon you will sell something they truly care about." He looked up at her, and in her calm eyes he saw the path ahead. Revenge would not come with shouting or fists. It would come with patience and law. The same tools Karen had twisted would become the blade that cut her empire down. Outside his windows the bulldozers sat idle, waiting for approval to break ground. Investors sipped champagne at Karen's house, laughing about the riches they would soon make. But the man sat at his table with papers spread wide, the firelight flickering across his determined face, and he whispered to himself that they thought his 2,000 acres were theirs. But soon the world would see whose homes really stood on stolen ground. The man knew silence was his greatest weapon, so while Karen and her board bragged about their victory, throwing parties with investors and walking around town with smug smiles, he stayed quiet, working late into the night with piles of documents spread across his wooden table. Old deeds yellow with age, property maps his grandfather had drawn, tax receipts that showed decades of ownership. Every scrap of paper was a piece of armor, proof that the land had always belonged to his family and still did. He carefully compared each one with the forged contracts the HOA had waved around, and the fraud became clearer with every page. Signatures that didn't match, dates that didn't exist, notary stamps from people long retired. It was sloppy and arrogant. The kind of work done by people who thought no one would ever question them. But he was questioning everything, and with each discovery his resolve grew sharper. During the day he walked his land quietly, observing, watching surveyors and workers still loitering on his fields, pretending to prepare for development. He didn't confront them anymore. Instead he noted every action, every intrusion, writing down times, dates, and faces, his notebook filling with evidence that would soon turn into a blade against the HOA. His wife stood by him, calm and steady, reminding him that patience was power, that exposing them at the right time would do more damage than any shouting match. In town, Karen grew louder, boasting in meetings that construction would begin soon, telling everyone she had done what no one else could, turning wasted land into profit for the community. The board clapped behind her, blind with greed, and the investors smiled, imagining their riches. But cracks had already begun to show. One county clerk raised an eyebrow when Karen submitted papers for approval, questioning the strange errors in the signatures. Another official hesitated when asked to approve road permits, saying the land title looked suspicious. Karen brushed them off with her usual arrogance. But unease spread quietly in offices and hallways, and the man knew it, because he had already started speaking with those very officials behind closed doors, showing them the real deeds, the real maps, the truth, They had promised discretion. But he could see their eyes widen when they saw the scale of fraud the HOA had attempted. More than just arrogance, it was criminal. His next step was to hire a lawyer, not one of the local ones. Afraid of Karen's influence, but a sharp outsider who had no reason to fear her. Together they built a case, a mountain of evidence strong enough to crush every lie Karen had told. At night he rehearsed the moment in his mind. The courtroom filled with neighbors and board members, Karen smiling until the truth dropped like a hammer. He could almost hear the gasp, almost see her face twist as the ground under her feet crumbled, but he didn't rush. Every day he gathered more, every detail. Carefully added, he even hired a private investigator who traced Karen's dealings with the investors, uncovering emails where she bragged about controlling the land before she had any legal claim, messages where she promised profits from property she didn't own, even receipts showing she had taken money under the table to push the deal forward. The pile of evidence grew taller than her lies, and when it was ready, he sealed it in boxes marked for court, waiting only for the right moment to strike. Outside, the land stood scarred but not broken, fences torn down, soil marked with stakes, but the roots of truth were deeper than any bulldozer could reach. He rode his horse across the fields one evening, the sun setting behind him, and in the distance he saw Karen standing with investors near the fence line, laughing loudly, holding a glass of wine, pointing at his fields as if they were hers. He stopped, watching them for a long time, his silence steady, his eyes unshaken. They saw only a man too quiet to fight back, but what they didn't see was the storm he was holding in his hands. A storm made of paper, law, and truth, and when it broke, their empire of arrogance would come crashing down in ruins, leaving only the land standing, stronger than before. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm that everyone in town could feel. The courthouse was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, some curious, some nervous, and many secretly hoping Karen would finally be exposed. The HOA board sat in the front row, stiff and red-faced, while Karen strutted in with her usual arrogance, wearing a bright red suit and smiling at investors who had gathered behind her. She spoke loudly about how victory was already certain, about how the man's land was now officially theirs, and that today was just a formality. She waved at the crowd as if she were a queen walking into her throne room, but her smile faltered slightly when she saw him enter, calm and quiet, carrying nothing but a worn leather folder in his hands, his wife walking beside him with steady eyes that made Karen shift uncomfortably, though she quickly covered it with a smirk. The judge entered and silence filled the room. The case began with Karen's lawyer speaking first, his voice sharp and rehearsed, presenting the so-called contracts that claimed the 2,000 acres had been sold to the HOA and its investors. He pointed to signatures, to dates, to flashy charts of proposed housing projects. He painted a picture of progress and community growth, his words smooth and confident. Neighbors shifted uneasily, the board nodded proudly, and Karen's smug grin returned. But then it was his turn. The man who had been silent for so long stood slowly, his calm presence pulling the room into a hush. He opened his folder and pulled out the first deed, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still clear. "This land has been in my family for generations," he said firmly, his voice steady, not loud, but carrying enough weight that every ear leaned closer. He placed the deed on the judge's desk, then pulled another, and another, deeds, tax records, maps, all carefully stacked. The judge leaned forward, studying them, raising his eyebrows as the truth unfolded. Then came the evidence of fraud, the forged signatures side by side with his real ones, the mismatched dates, the notary stamps belonging to people who had retired years before. The courtroom gasped, whispers filling the air. The judge's face hardened. Karen's smile froze, her lawyer stammered, trying to object, but the man wasn't finished. He handed over copies of emails uncovered by his investigator. Messages where Karen bragged about selling the land before she even had legal claim. Messages where she promised investors profits from property that was never hers. The investors sitting in the courtroom began to shift, their faces red with anger, some glaring at Karen with betrayal, others muttering loudly that they had been lied to. The man's calm voice cut through the chaos. "This is not just arrogance, it is fraud," he said. "They tried to steal what was never theirs, and in doing so, they deceived this court, this community, and the very people who trusted them." The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The crowd could see the truth. The board members who once sat proudly behind Karen now looked pale, avoiding her eyes. One even stood and walked out, Unable to face the shame, Karen tried to recover, standing up with a forced smile, her voice trembling as she shouted, "These are lies. He forged these himself, he is the criminal, not me." But her words were weak, no longer backed by the illusion of power. The judge silenced her with a stern glare. "Enough, the evidence is clear," he declared. "This land belongs to him, it always has, and the documents you presented are fraudulent. This court will open a full investigation into the HOA's actions." Gasps filled the room, some neighbors clapping before being silenced by the bailiff. The investors stormed out, shouting that they would sue Karen for every penny. The man sat back down, calm as ever, his wife placing a steady hand on his shoulder. Around him the whispers grew. People realizing the storm they had feared for so long had finally broken. And it was Karen who stood in the wreckage, her face pale, her hands trembling, her empire of lies crumbling in front of everyone. She tried to shout again. But no one listened, her voice drowned by the weight of truth and justice. The judge's gavel struck once more, final and heavy, sealing her fate, and as the room emptied, the man stood tall, knowing this was only the beginning of his revenge. Because clearing his name was not enough, next he would take from them the very homes they thought were safe, turning their arrogance into the fire that would consume them all. The courtroom victory should have been enough, but for him it was only the start. Karen and her board had not just tried to steal his land. They had mocked his family's legacy, humiliated him in public, and laughed as bulldozers rolled across his fields. So clearing his name was justice, but revenge demanded more. When the judge ordered a deeper investigation, the findings were worse than anyone imagined. The HOA had tied their own houses and community funds directly into the fraudulent deal, using their neighborhood as collateral for a sale that was never real. It was bold, stupid, and now legally dangerous. The man's lawyer explained calmly that because of the fraud he could claim damages, enough to strip the HOA of everything they owned. At first he hesitated, but then he remembered the smirk on Karen's face when she declared his land belonged to her. He remembered the investors laughing as they raised glasses over his stolen fields. And he decided there would be no mercy. Paperwork was filed swiftly. The law that Karen once used as a weapon now turned against her. Within weeks a legal order was granted, allowing him to seize HOA-controlled properties and sell them to recover damages. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors gasped as letters arrived at their doors informing them that their houses were being repossessed. The very same way Karen had once sent fake notices to others. But this time it was real. This time it was final. Karen stormed into the street screaming that it was impossible, that the community belonged to her. But when the sheriff's deputies arrived with official documents, she froze, her face pale as she realized she could not fight the law. The houses went up for auction one by one. Investors who had backed her now stood in line to buy them, smirking at the irony. The HOA members who once followed her blindly begged for mercy, pleading that their families would be homeless. But the man only reminded them of how they had cheered when Karen tried to throw him off his own land. "You thought my acres were yours," he said coldly. "Now let's see how it feels when your houses are mine." The auctions drew crowds, people whispering about the man who turned the tables so completely. Each hammer strike of the auctioneer was like thunder. Another nail in the coffin of Karen's empire. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA now laughed quietly as they packed up and left, carrying boxes out of homes they once thought untouchable. Karen tried to rally them, promising she would appeal, screaming in meetings that the man had tricked them. But no one listened anymore. Her voice was just noise, drowned out by the sound of her empire burning. The day her own house was sold was the day she broke. She stood on her porch shouting at the buyers, threatening to call the police. But the sheriff standing beside her reminded her coldly that she was the criminal, not the victim. She finally collapsed, sinking to the ground, sobbing as the deed to her house was signed over. The man watched quietly from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, no gloating, no laughter, just silence. Because for him the revenge was not in her tears, it was in the balance restored, the truth proven, and the land defended. When the dust settled, he returned to his fields, riding across his acres as the sun set, the wind rushing through the grass, his heart finally steady. Behind him the HOA neighborhood stood half empty, houses with new owners, streets stripped of Karen's rule, her legacy reduced to rubble. His wife rode beside him, her calm smile reflecting the peace they had fought for. And as he looked out over his 2,000 acres, he whispered to himself that the land had survived, stronger than ever, and those who had tried to steal it had lost everything. It was not just victory, it was revenge, final and complete, carved into history like the fields his family had always worked. When the dust finally settled, the town was no longer the same. The once proud HOA neighborhood stood quiet, many houses sold, some abandoned, and the streets that once echoed with Karen's commands now carried only silence. People whispered about her downfall, about how she had gone from ruling the boardroom with arrogance to losing her home with tears. Her name spoken not with fear anymore but with pity and scorn. Yet while her empire of lies crumbled, his land stood tall and untouched, stronger than ever. The man walked the edges of his 2,000 acres with a calm heart, the fences repaired, the fields breathing free, the orchards blossoming, the cattle grazing peacefully. The soil under his boots felt alive again, and every sunrise brought him a reminder that legacy can survive any storm. His wife stood beside him, her presence steady as always. She had watched silently when Karen mocked them, when bulldozers cut into their land, and when papers were forged to erase their history. Now she stood proud, knowing patience and truth had brought justice. Neighbors who once whispered in fear now came to him with respect, some even ashamed that they had once believed Karen's lies. They apologized, offering help to rebuild fences, to plant trees, to show gratitude for the man who had defended not just his own acres but the principle that no bully, no fraud, no greedy board could strip away what was rightfully earned. In the town square people told the story again and again, how one quiet man with patience and evidence had turned the mighty HOA into dust. Children grew up hearing his name like a legend, the farmer who sold their houses after they tried to steal his fields. He never raised his voice, never bent his knee. He let truth be his weapon, and it struck harder than any blade. Karen herself disappeared from public life, her red suits gone, her confident smile erased. Sometimes people said they saw her walking through town with her head down, avoiding eyes, too ashamed to meet the stares of those who once feared her. And while her story became a warning, his became an example. One evening as the sun dipped low, he saddled his horse and rode slowly across the wide stretch of his land, the horizon glowing orange and gold, the air filled with the calls of birds returning to the trees he had planted. He paused at the highest hill, looking down at the farmhouse, the barns, the fields stretching endlessly, and beyond them the hollow streets of the HOA. He felt no anger anymore, only pride, because revenge had been taken. Justice had been served, and peace had returned. His wife joined him on her horse, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun, and he said softly, almost to himself, "They thought my acres were theirs, but now my acres remain, and theirs are gone." She smiled quietly, her eyes reflecting the glow of evening, and in that silence they both knew the story was complete, the land restored, the legacy protected, and the memory of betrayal buried under the ruins of the HOA's greed. The man sat tall in the saddle, the wind carrying the scent of soil and grass across his fields, the weight of generations resting on his shoulders but no longer heavy. Instead it was light, filled with pride. The land was his, the legacy was his, and nothing and no one would ever take it again.